All right, guys, we are back to talk about some of the playoff games that we saw this past weekend, mainly on Saturday, because we got to get through all of them. They were all pretty fascinating to watch, obviously, even though I mentioned the disparity in some of the outcomes, right, with a good amount of blowouts. There were some things to take away from these games. And starting off with this one, it's another year and another first round playoff loss for the Steelers, who fall to the Ravens 28 to 14, like I mentioned before, in what was one of the most, I would say, one of the most uninspiring games between both of these two teams. Despite the score, you look at it and you're thinking 28 to 14. It was like pretty decently matched, but I think that the score is a bit misleading. Quite honestly, I thought this was on its way to being like 42 to 7 or 42 to like 13 or something like that. It felt like that, especially in the first half. And really, the stat that says it all to me was that Baltimore outrushed the Steelers 299 yards to only 29 from the Steelers side of things. So the most rushing yards the Steelers have allowed in a playoff game in over 50 years. And like I mentioned before, it felt like it was on its way to being a complete rout of the Steelers, and the disparity in quality of both teams was seen in the first half, really, when the Ravens were leading 28 to nothing. And from that point on, I thought they were just going to be keep chugging along, and it was not going to be pretty for the Steelers. But the Steelers got something going in the second half. They put together like a 92-yard drive to start the second half, or 98-yard drive, excuse me, and they made it 21 to 7, but the Ravens responded with a touchdown, making it 28 to 7. And then Pittsburgh scored again through a long touchdown pass to George Pickens, and then we got our final score of 28 to 14, where the Steelers had opportunities to get even closer, but they failed on a fourth down attempt, and Baltimore basically ran out the game with like a 10-play drive, and that was pretty much it. So that ultimately led to the Steelers' sixth consecutive playoff loss. They haven't won one since 2016, and to kind of encapsulate the whole season, they started this year obviously 10 and 13, and everyone's asking the question about, was Russ always the answer? Is this Steelers team capable of being a threat in the playoffs? Has Mike Tomlin finally figured it out for them to get back and win at least one playoff game? Is this their best chance to ever do that? And then after they start the year 10 and 3, they end it 0 and 5. Their fifth straight game scoring less than 17 points and allowing 19 points or more, right? Obviously, you can do the math there. In all those games, if you score no more than 17 and you keep allowing 19 or more, obviously they've lost all of those games. And really, just briefly here to talk about Baltimore, because this is probably going to be mostly about the Steelers and just how disappointing it was. For the Ravens, it was a dominant performance, and I think no one's really surprised with how this game played out, mainly because of these two guys, right? Lamar and Derrick Henry. In the Ravens' first playoff game with Derrick Henry, he had 26 carries, 186 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And Lamar also, not too shabby with his numbers, 81 rushing yards. I mean, Lamar outrushed the Steelers on his own on 15 carries, and he also threw 2 passing touchdowns as well, all without his Pro Bowl wide receiver, Zay Flowers, right? I mean, if I look at it now, like the pass catchers for the Ravens were the usual Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely, Rashad Bateman also, but also Tylan Wallace caught a pass, Anthony Miller caught 3, Nelson Aguilar caught 1 of them, and really no receiver had more than 3 receptions, but still a very dominant performance, mainly through the running game. And, I mean, you look at the third down conversions alone, the Ravens had double of what the Steelers had. They were 10 of 15. The Steelers were only 5 of 11, less than 50%, while the Ravens were converting at about 66%. And also the red zone efficiency. The Steelers technically never got in the red zone, and the Ravens converted on 3 of their 4 trips to the red zone. So that alone just tells you enough of the, efficiency and the level that each of these teams is really running on. But um, for Baltimore, I guess, it's just, I think this year, watching them for a good amount of this year, not just yesterday, but for a good part of this year, yes, there were some moments where it was questionable, like that Raiders loss was pretty bad. And even the Steelers loss, where Justin Tucker misses some field goals and really the Steelers don't score a touchdown, but they still win. There were some definite low moments in this season, but overall, where they are now and where they've been able to bring this team to at the level that they're playing at, it feels very different, right? Because before, in previous years in the playoffs, with just Lamar and maybe like a Justice Hill or Gus Edwards, yes, they were going to have success with their running game, but now, obviously, with Derrick Henry, it just looks a lot more like unstoppable. It looks a lot more like just once it gets going, there's no stopping it. And that's a very dangerous thing to kind of play with, right? You got to try and stop one of these guys, and then they're also able to throw it to Zay, to Mark Andrews, to Isaiah Likely. So it just looks and it feels a lot different than years before, and it definitely feels like it could be their year if anybody still had any doubts about that. And it at least feels like it's their best shot at it, right? Because before they were talented, they were capable of doing it, but now, again, there's something to it, right? With Derrick Henry there, it feels very, very much like a mismatch in most of their games. So we'll see how far they can take that, but again, the result wasn't anything that I think surprised a lot of people. I think a lot of people expected this to be a Baltimore Ravens win, but where the Steelers stand now, first, it's just more of the same, I think, for the Steelers, right? Where they stand right now is, ironically, funny enough, very similar to where they stood a year ago, right? It's more of the same old tendencies and some of the same old problems that keep showing up for this team. More of a lack of a running game, right? I already told you that the Ravens outrushed the Steelers by like over 200 yards. So obviously a huge problem when you're talking about playoff teams. A really bad offensive line that started off pretty decent looking, but then over the course of this season, just watching the games, and I've watched almost all of them, like there was just so many missed assignments, someone going over to block someone that there was already an offensive lineman going there, two guys running into each other, a tight end missing a block here or there, someone just getting flat out beat, which is already enough to deal with. But when you're shooting yourself in the foot a lot of the times, or just not getting off the ball quickly enough, not being in the right spot, it just got a lot worse and worse over the season, and that was very disappointing to see, especially because, you got some decent guys like Zach Frazier and Mason McCormick playing pretty well. There was just too much of a schematic sort of deterioration over the season that was very disappointing. The poor starts, I mean, it just continues to be something you identify this Steelers team with, right? When the game starts and they get their opening drive, nobody expects them to score. They haven't had an opening drive touchdown all year, and they've been outscored 63-0 in their last 5 playoff games in the first quarter, which, if you keep starting off slow with the lack of offensive weapons that this team has outside of one guy, it gets to the results you see, obviously, right? No different than yesterday, or Saturday, excuse me. And really defensively, I thought when you're getting into the playoffs, and this defense, I think, gets criticized more so than I would actually criticize them for, but one thing that they don't really do too well is take one thing away, right? This Ravens team looked like they were capable of running it like they did, but it looks like they were also capable of picking them apart through the pass. And if you're not taking anything away with how good this defense is, I think that does fall on the players, certainly, but I think that also falls on, again, the coaching, the coordinators, and things like that. So that was something else that I will be critical of the defense on, the lack of turnovers. If this team's not getting turnovers, it really makes it a struggle because of that fact that I mentioned. They're not able to take anything away, so they just kind of have their head spinning, right? They don't really know what's coming, and that's also very disappointing. And just for a thought for you guys, right, how we talked about the Commanders and how new everything was for them and just how exciting things are for them right now. Jaden Daniels, a rookie quarterback, in the first quarter last night, he had a 92-yard touchdown, a 92-yard drive that lasted well over 9 minutes to start the game. And that's with an offense that has Diami Brown, Zacchaeus, Terry McLaurin, Brian Robinson, and Zach Ertz. You can't tell me that offense is capable of holding a 92-yard drive for 9 minutes, and the Steelers, who have a very similar skill-based position group, can't even hold like a 3-minute drive and can't not go 3 and out for the first 3 drives of the game, right? That same thing, you have basically the same two teams, same level on offense, and one team is significantly better than the other. There's obviously a problem there, right? Apart from just the players, there's obviously a coaching, a schematic problem there that's just making it a lot harder for the Steelers than it is for the Commanders, right? My buddy texted me on Saturday when I was watching the game, and he was watching the game, that it was painful to watch this offense, right? And you couldn't have said it better than that, right? It just feels like it's such a struggle to gain like 3 yards or get a first down, let alone like driving down the field and scoring a touchdown. So that's something that this team definitely has to try and fix. And looking ahead, right, on that, prowess of this team, a lot of the question marks are obviously still with the quarterback, still with the offensive line that needs improvement, a lack of weapons, a lack of running game, and yes, a lot of that probably falls on Mike Tomlin, and that's obviously the biggest, that's the elephant in the room. But again, on the Mike Tomlin thing, I just feel like, yes, it's getting old, and yes, just having a winning season is obviously not good enough anymore, and you understand the frustrations there. But to just say that you need to fire him feels a bit short-sighted, because you just don't know who's going to come and be the new head coach, right? Everyone talks about the Steelers having 3 head coaches in all of their franchise's history. For that to, for another guy to land at the Steelers and just continue that for the next like 15 years or something like that, you just don't know if you're going to have a guy like that, or if you're just going to really fall off and start looking and shuffling through head coaches year in and year out. So that's really the biggest doubt I have, right? If Mike Tomlin wants to leave, that's different than just firing or trading him. I don't think the Steelers would really do that. But in terms of everybody else, right, if you're not changing like something about this offense schematically, game planning wise, I don't know if you fire Arthur Smith. Again, that feels pretty impulsive for the Steelers to do after one season, but there are some question marks definitely still there. Terrell Austin at the defensive coordinator, for as good as the players are, and as good as, as much as people criticize Tomlin for having good players on his team and not really getting the most out of it, I think you got to look at Terrell Austin with this defense that he's had now for a couple years now, and to still have a lot of question marks. I think that is a position and a spot where you could think about moving on. Their offensive line coach, Pat Meyer, is another one that definitely I feel like needs to move on, because this offensive line's not getting any better. And, the best way I could think about the Steelers right now when it comes to playoff teams and just kind of sneaking into the playoffs, and, the record that they have about not winning a playoff game since 2016, now it feels like the Steelers are sort of like when you're at a party, right, and everyone's there that's supposed to be there, all the good teams, all the people that are supposed to be there are at this party. It feels like the Steelers are the one person that sneaks into the party through the back door, something like that. They're there, they're happy to be there. Some might say they're lucky to be there at this party, so to say, until somebody points to them out, they face off against somebody, or they meet with somebody that identifies them as they're not supposed to be there, and they just get kicked out of the party as soon as somebody picks them out, right? It's not hard to pick the Steelers out as a team that's really, over the last few years, looked like they're not supposed to be in the playoffs. So they keep saying the standard is the standard, and the standard seems to be championships, right? But now I feel like people are starting to look at this team as, the standard is the standard. It seems to start turning into something like, the standard is only just barely making the playoffs. And if that turns out to be the case, then, you just have to change something drastically, right? If you want to keep, harping on that, you can't keep things the same, or else you're not really living up to that. So a lot of things to figure out, obviously, in the offseason. We'll see how much they actually change, because the Steelers are pretty stubborn to seeing a lot of change, but we'll see where we are, in terms of the quarterback, right? Both of them also are free agents. So that's probably the biggest question that they have to tackle. But that is a lot on the Steelers, no different than the last off seasons have been. But we are going to be able to move on now to the last review of a playoff game that we have on today's show. Another Saturday game, this one between the Texans and the Chargers. The Texans getting a big win at home over the Chargers. The Texans come in as underdogs, and they prove a lot of people wrong that had doubts about them going forward. So we're going to recap that game, talk about Justin Herbert, talk about the Chargers, and also more on the Texans defense when we return.